Hi, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. This is Ryan Crodel at Valence Health, and thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here today for this webinar. I'm showing just about a minute before the top of the hour, and it looks like we've got quite a few people still logging into the webinar. So we're going to give it a few more minutes before we get started here. So stand by. We will get started in just a few minutes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. This is Ryan Crodel at Valence Health. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here for this webinar on biometric parameters and why they matter, which we'll dive deep on as we go through this 45 minutes or hour or so presentation. But a few housekeeping items before we dive in. Well, if you have any questions, we like to keep these as interactive as possible. So please do ask questions or let us know if there's anything you want me to dive deeper on. I will be your host and the presenter here today. So I'll be monitoring the questions as they come in. Please do submit your questions through the GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll address those as they come in. And so please do utilize that functionality and let me know if you've got questions or you want me to go into more detail on anything we cover here. Secondly, one of the questions we always get is, will the slides be made available, and is this being recorded? So the answer to those questions are yes to both. We will make the slides available as well as the recording of this webinar. So if you have any colleagues or anyone else you think might be interested in this topic that is not able to join us here live today, then please do share those links to both the recording and the slides. When you get them, we'll follow up with an email to everyone who attended and who registered for the webinar following this webinar. Usually within 24 hours, we make those available for everyone. So please do share with anyone you think might be interested. So with that, I will go ahead and dive in on the topic around biometric parameters. So before we get into the details on what are biometric parameters, it's important to understand what is PPG. So biometric parameters are a derivative or an adjunct to the PPG waveform and the PPG signal. So let's just set a baseline with what is PPG. PPG is a shortened version of what is known as photoplethysmography, which I won't make anyone spell. There it is. It is the methodology of shining light into the body and then measuring how much of that light is reflected back based on blood flow. This methodology has been around for decades and is still used in hospitals and healthcare facilities with the finger clips and earlobe clips that measure vital signs and pulse ox and other things. That is using this methodology of photoplethysmography, and that is now deployed in a variety of different devices and mechanisms, thanks to many different innovations that have made this methodology of photoplethysmography motion tolerant and therefore wearable in a variety of different devices. As you can see in this diagram, the methodology is, as I mentioned, shining light into the body and measuring how much of that light's reflected back based on blood flow. That is a very difficult thing to do, particularly when the body is in motion. And so it's relatively easy when the body is perfectly still, although it is still challenging. But as you start to move around, the light gets scattered even further than it's already scattered by shining it into the body. And it makes it that much more difficult to find the little signal here that is actually based on blood flow at capillary beds, which is what these sensors are looking for. And just to give you a frame of reference or a sense of context, it's less than 1% of the signal that's coming into this photodetector here that is actually based on blood flow and is a useful signal for measuring a variety of different biometrics. So you're trying to find a needle in a haystack continuously while someone is doing whatever they're doing when they're wearing a device like this. The MEMS motion sensor is also a key element here to help identify and put into context some of that motion noise that's coming into the photodetector here, and the accelerometers that are key parts of these sensor systems are important for doing that, as well as providing some other contextual information that I will talk about later. So that's a baseline around what is PPG, and as many of you know, PPG sensors have become the dominant biometric sensor technology or methodology in wearable devices today, but also in a pretty broad range of different form factors and use cases and industries. Most people think of wearables as smartwatches and earbuds and fitness bands, and that is certainly a healthy growing market. But this same sensor technology that's going into all of these devices is also used in a broad range of other devices. Health and medical devices is a huge area of growth for these biometric sensors, hearing aids being a subset of that, of those health and medical devices, industrial and military applications, AR and VR headsets, even smartphones. Some of them today have PPG sensors embedded into the back of the devices. And this is just a high-level look at the different devices. There are certainly many others that these biometric sensors are being embedded to today. Now, that doesn't mean this is easy to do, and unfortunately, this study's I think a couple of years old now, but it does highlight the fact that creating these biometric wearables to measure accurately is still very difficult, and it's challenging on a variety of different fronts. But you've got to solve some fundamental scientific challenges around the motion artifacts that get introduced into the photodetector and come in through the sensor as a raw signal, and then being able to put that additional information that's coming into the sensor in context around what the individual is actually doing, in addition to getting at that very small signal that actually is based on blood flow. Requires deep cross-disciplinary expertise in hardware and optomechanics and firmware and the algorithms that are processing the data Obviously, there's a great deal of data science and machine learning and AI that goes on behind the scenes in processing this data. And these devices have to be tested on a broad range of people doing a broad range of activities to make sure it works on a diverse population set. And then also the manufacturing expertise at scale, because these devices do have to interact with the human body. They getting the same level of performance you see coming off the scaled manufacturing line can sometimes be different than what you've seen in the lab or on the bench. So it's hard. And most of those challenges fall into 5 different categories. Some of you may have seen some of these before, so I'll go over this relatively quickly, but these are the top 5, at least, that we see most commonly. It's by no means the only challenges, but optical noise, as I mentioned before, is a primary challenge, not just from the motion artifacts coming in to the sensor, but also in the ambient light and environmental light coming into that photodetector that needs to be distinguished from the light coming off the emitter that has been reflected off of blood flow. Skin tone can be an issue in some cases, and even things like tattoos can impact the performance of these devices, mainly because of the different absorption patterns for various wavelengths of light. There are ways to mitigate this issue and in most cases eliminate this issue, but it can be an issue with some sensor technology today. Blood perfusion is actually a big one, depending on where the sensor is located and how the blood is perfused through the body at that particular location. In general, in terms of the sensor location and the form factor, the head is a great place to measure biometrics optically, and as you move further and further down the body, out on the limbs in particular, the more difficult it is to measure biometrics optically. And then last, what we refer to as a crossover problem is related to the optical noise here, but it more specifically an issue where some PPG sensors have a tendency to lock on to step rate as opposed to heart rate and report that number as heart rate, even though it's actually step rate. And this happens primarily in sports and fitness use cases where you see as jogging or running as an example, where the step rate and the heart rate can be in similar cadences, and you get this crossover problem where the optical monitor locks on to step rate as opposed to heart rate. So those challenges are all overcomable and have been addressed with the better sensor technology on the market today. And when you get it right, and this gets back to one of the reasons why PPG sensor technology has come to dominate wearable devices and mobile devices in general, is that you can the PPG waveform is really feature rich in terms of the kinds of metrics you can get off of the waveform. Heart rate obviously is one of the most common uses, if not the most common, but you can also get the RR interval, or the time between beats of the heart, which has implications for both fitness levels and health and medical conditions as well. You can get respiration dynamics, and particularly breathing rate out of the PPG sensor, an indication of perfusion and how that perfusion varies when an individual wearing the device is doing different things. And then you can also see things like pulse pressure as it relates to the amplitude of some of these waveforms. So when you get it right, there's a rich set of features that can be directly measured with the PPG waveform. And as we'll get to talking to in more detail here in just a moment, there's additional biometric parameters that can come out of the waveform that are also extremely useful for driving compelling use cases. And that's really, we always encourage our customers to start with the end in mind around the user experience. So what is the device intended to do? What problem is it intended to solve? Or what condition is it intended to address? And work backwards from there to identify the assessments required to support that user experience or that address that condition. And then what are the key metrics, what are the biometrics that are needed as inputs to these assessments in order to create that user experience? And then what are the best sensor technologies to actually generate those metrics in the intended use case, in the intended form factor or wearable, to feed those user experiences there. So this is kind of how we think about the user experience and also the data flow in how you create a device and a user experience that is going to be compelling and also address the intended use case effectively. So let's look at the real-time biometric parameters in a little more detail. That's why everyone's here, right? The parameters. So let's look at. So just looking at the definition of a parameter is at a very high level any characteristic that can help define or classify a particular system, and this is really any. Looking at any parameter as a broad definition here. So the way we think about this is a biometric parameter reflects an element or elements of the human vascular system and or the blood flow dynamics within that system that are useful in identifying or evaluating the performance, status, condition of that individual and or that system. Again, coming back to this piece, in the service of a user experience that helps an individual accomplish a goal or manage a disease or a condition of some kind, or provide some valuable insight into how their body is actually responding to what they're putting it through. So let's look at the specifics around the biometric parameters as we define them here at Valencell. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but these are the ones that we have seen the most interest, the most use, and the most value generated out of when we're talking about the biometric parameters. So the first one is a signal quality indicator, and this is as you might guess, is a numerical indicator on a second-by-second basis of the quality of the incoming PPG signal. So it has obvious importance for knowing when you can and cannot trust the data coming off of the PPG sensor for analytics and assessment purposes to be able to present that in a meaningful user experience. That enable estimations of how that blood is flowing and the volume associated, the volume patterns associated with that blood flow. And I'll show you why that matters in just a bit. But this is one of the more powerful biometric parameters in looking at different use cases and providing some really valuable contextual information about those blood flow characteristics. And then, of course, there's the non-pulsatile amplitude. So this is an indication of the signal coming from the sensor that is not driven by the pulse wave. And as you saw before, that has implications around the respiration characteristics and the breathing rate, but also can be used for for other analysis as well. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. The ambient light average. So this is an estimate of the total amount of light coming into the photodetector, including that coming from the emitters in the sensor module itself, as well as other ambient light sources. And I'll talk more about how that's being used and what that's being used for more in just a moment. And then, of course, activity characterization. So this refers back to the inertial sensor or the accelerometer that is commonly included in as a part of these PPG sensor systems. And this allows you to categorize the movement patterns for inputs into biometric assessments and helps you identify, at least at a high level, what that individual is doing and the intensity of those activities, and enables you to put that in the context of the blood flow dynamics that are coming through in the PPG signal. So looks like we had one question come through. Good question here. So I thought you needed a full ECG waveform to analyze HRV. Do you have devices that provide raw PPG that can be analyzed by separate software? Okay, so two separate questions. One is you do not need a full ECG waveform to analyze heart rate variability. The PPG sensor technology has gotten accurate enough now, at least the high performance PPG sensor systems on the market today, including those from Valencell, can analyze the beat-to-beat data in an accurate way that allows you to generate HRV calculations through whichever mechanism you want to generate HRV, whether that's RMSSD or some other calculation. And those are a standard output from the Valencell sensor module. The RR intervals are. So those can be used in HRV calculations. And also, I should mention, those are motion tolerant outputs of the RR interval signal. So it can tolerate some motion. What we like to refer to it as daily living or daily activity motion characteristics. It is not going to work in a high intensity activity like a running or biking or swimming or something along those lines. Second question you had was devices providing raw PPG data. In general, we do not provide, at least we Valencell do not provide the raw PPG signal. We provide the outputs, the motion tolerant outputs of heart rate and RR interval and a variety of other different metrics, including these biometric parameters that allow analysis off of those outputs as opposed to the raw PPG. Great questions. Keep them coming. If you have any others, please do submit those through the GoToWebinar control panel. So let's look at these in each in a little more detail. So the signal quality indicator, not surprisingly, is a way to understand the quality of that signal coming in. And this could be a case where the device is not being worn properly, or there is something being worn between the sensor and the skin, or some other factor is corrupting the signal. Either way, this allows you to know when that is happening and to throw out any data that falls below a certain threshold on this signal quality indicator. And our customers have found this extremely useful to be able to understand and provide greater accuracy in the assessments that they are generating off of the sensor, the sensor data coming in, and know which data to use and which data not to use. Looks like there's another question coming in. That's why I'm pausing. Could signal quality or non-pulsatile amplitude be able to identify ghost heart rate values, i.e. values that are output when someone is not wearing the sensor, but the sensor is on? Yeah, so that's exactly one of the primary use cases is using this signal quality indicator along with one other feature function that I didn't have listed here, which is a being worn indicator that that can identify when the sensor is no longer being worn and is no longer close enough to the skin where it's actually measuring blood flow, and then you can use that information to either turn off the sensor or turn off the device, or again, not use the data that is coming in off the sensor after that the signal quality falls below a certain threshold, and that triggers the being worn indicator. Another good question. So this, I think this is pretty straightforward in terms of the signal quality indicator. The normalized pulsatile amplitude gives you, as I mentioned, insights into that, into those blood flow characteristics, which allow you to see certainly the perfusion estimation, like I mentioned before, allows you to see the pulse pressure. In fact, this is one of the inputs into how Valencell is now measuring blood pressure with PPG sensors. But also there's implications here in terms of blood oxygenation and cardiac output. And I'm not suggesting this is a direct measurement of any of these things, but it is an input that provides additional information about the signal coming in, and particularly for early prototyping and for testing purposes, and even for clinical research purposes. This can be used to provide additional context, again, as to how that individual is responding to the different activities that they may be doing at the time. Another question come in: can the signal quality be used to determine where the PPG is measured, like the finger, wrist, or arm? Great question, and I can't say that. So the short answer is yes. I'm not aware of anyone using it for those particular purposes, but there are certainly different signal quality indications from different body locations. What you'll tend to see, though, is there are that signal quality indicator is tuned for the device that it's built into. So it's not necessarily a standard metric across all different devices and different body locations. So it provides contextual information for the signal at that particular body location. But I think what your question's getting at, there are certainly differences in the signal quality at different body locations, whether that's finger, wrist, or arm, as you mentioned, or other body locations. And of course, that signal quality changes in different patterns based on what the individual is doing with that particular device at that body location. So there's a lot of confounding factors there that go into that signal quality. Another question that's just come in is, can you get a good PPG signal on the chest? We have done testing with patches with PPG sensors embedded in those patches and used on the chest and the torso, and we have seen good signals off of the chest. Again, it depends on the use case and the amount of motion and activity involved. As to where exactly on the chest is best, or maybe on the torso is best, but that's why you got to test these devices early and often. And but the short answer is yes, you can get a good PPG signal on the chest. There are other better body locations, but particularly on the head, but it's possible on the chest as well. Looks like that's all the questions for now. Great questions. Keep them coming, please. The next one is the non-pulsatile amplitude. So as I mentioned, this is This is the part of the signal not driven by the pulse wave. It's got implications around breathing rate and other respiration characteristics. So unhealthy patterns in respiration rate or the respiration signal, and has implications also in the overall cardiovascular system health in what those in how that non-pulsatile amplitude changes, particularly on a longitudinal scale. So next one is the ambient light average. So most of these use cases that this supports, and again, remember, this is all of the light, an estimate of all of the light coming into the sensor, regardless of where it's coming from. And most of the most common uses for this relate to identifying how much time an individual who's wearing that device is spending indoors or outdoors. Just given the power of the sun and sunlight in particular, it gives you a pretty good indication of sunlight exposure and the amount of time spent outside versus inside, as one simple use case there. And lastly is the activity categorization. So identifying when a person is at rest or walking or running or falling or doing other activities that may provide valuable information around the PPG signal. Just as an example, if the individual or the activity categorization and the accelerometer is seeing that an individual is at rest, but their heart rate is going through the roof, that is a very different scenario than someone who is out for a run and their heart rate is significantly elevated. And you can see that with the activity categorization here. So the implications and the response to those two scenarios is very different based on the activity of the individual involved. So sorry, got another question coming in. Which location on the head is best? Great question. We have found the ear to be probably the best combination of great PPG signal, limited motion artifacts, just given that the ear tends to be relatively stable, assuming you've got a good design in the device that maintains stability in the ear. And then also that combined with people are accustomed to wearing things like earbuds in their earbuds or hearing aids or other things like that in their ear. The forehead is also a good place, a very good place actually. It's just that most people tend to not want to wear things on their forehead, at least for extended periods of time. But that is also another good location. Even down the neck certainly is also a good place as well. But again, the form factor and the usability implications there are a little more challenging in getting people to wear things around their neck. And but it depends on the use case and what you're trying to do with the device. Looks like that's all the questions at the moment. Oh, sorry. What commercially available sensors allow you to access the biometric parameters mentioned? So all of the parameters mentioned, valence cell sensors support. I know there are others out there in the market that provide some of those. I honestly don't know which sensors and which biometric parameters are available from other sensor companies, but I can speak for valence cell, and we support all of these the biometric parameters mentioned. Looks like that's it for the questions now, but yeah, more great questions, keep them coming. So why is this important? Why do these matter, and how have companies seen value out of these biometric parameters? Well, one is new use cases. So being able to support an extended roadmap for more insightful assessments and analytics off of the biometric sensor data that's coming into a device. So I'll talk about how some of our customers are using these biometric parameters in just a moment. So this will give you a sense of how this is working, and give you some very specific examples there. But using this data to support new use cases, either in replacement of existing devices or entirely new use cases that have not been possible before. The data quality is a key implication here for these biometric parameters, not just the signal quality indicator, but also being able to use something like the activity characterization to be able to hone in on what an individual is doing as those measurements and as those biometric signals are coming in, and understanding the context around that signal to be able to identify different patterns of movement and the associated changes in the biometric signals. And then lastly is fewer sensors. So the accelerometer is one example there of, and our sensors at least provide access to that raw accelerometry data, so you don't have to add another accelerometer to the device. We use that accelerometer obviously for identifying motion artifacts and the activity characteristics. But if you want to use that accelerometer for something else that is valuable for that device in that use case, that's available there, and you don't have to add another sensor for that. I'll talk about another example of the elimination of other sensor modalities in just a moment. But at a high level, these are the categories of value that most people and most companies that are using these biometric parameters find in using this additional information beyond just the heart rate and the R interval and other standard metrics that come out of these sensors. A few more questions have come in, so I'll pause here to take those. How does the heart rate accuracy change as the device gets closer to the heart, i.e. wrist, forearm versus ear? Yeah, great question. So as I mentioned, the ear is one of the best places on the body, if not the best place on the body to measure biometrics. So that is, as it relates to optical sensors, about the best location you can do. The wrist is a pretty terrible place to measure biometrics optically, mostly because of the physiology of the wrist, and that there's bone, muscle, tendon, a variety of different things that scatter that light even further than is already scattered by shining it into human tissue. And there's also a large number of motion artifacts. People tend to move their hands and their arms a lot, and but at the same time, people like to wear things like watches on their wrist, and that's where a lot of these sensors are getting embedded. So that's challenges we are overcoming. To your question though, as you move, as a general rule, as you move further up the arm and closer to the heart, so the forearm is better than the wrist, and the upper arm is better than the forearm, which is better than the wrist. So as you move up the arm, the better, in general, the accuracy gets from these sensor modules. Next question is, does Valencell provide the PPG data after processing or just the parameters? If I understand your question correctly, we provide the post-process PPG data around heart rate and RR interval and the activity metrics, and then we also provide the biometric parameters in addition to that. And these are all of these, the directly measured. Let me come back to one of the slides that I showed you before. So these key metrics that you see here, we provide as standard outputs. Blood pressure is coming soon, so I probably should have put that in a different color, but the rest of these metrics are directly measured metrics that we provide as standard outputs, as well as the real-time biometric parameters. So all of those things are available for the host processor of the device that the sensor is embedded into, available to call on 1-second intervals if they want that level of granularity in the data. But all of those are standard outputs from our sensors. Let's see, got another question. Can PPG sensor on the forehead provide information on brain activity? That is not possible with PPG sensors anywhere, to my knowledge, and including the forehead. As I mentioned, it is still, the PPG sensor is looking at the blood flow dynamics and the blood flow characteristics, and is not able to see brain activity directly. Now, of course, the heart rate variability, or the RR interval, is a reflection of the autonomic nervous system's response to the fight or flight or rest and relaxation responses, which obviously have implications around brain activity, but it is not a direct measurement of brain activity. Let's see, next question is HRV provided second-by-second moving average. Okay, so yeah, let me come back to this diagram. So what we provide, and I'm speaking for Valencell specifically, I'm not entirely sure how other sensor companies do it, but what we do is provide the RR interval measurement on a second-by-second metric, and to your point, or to your other question, the second-by-second moving average, we on a second-by-second basis, we will provide all of the intervals, the heartbeat intervals in that last second of data. So it's not a moving average, it's the intervals within that last second, assuming you're calling that data every second. If you call it, say, once every 5 seconds, we'll give you all of the RR peaks in that 5 second, in that last 5 second interval since the last time you called that, did the API call. Let's see, is multiple photodiode helpful for increasing PPG accuracy? In general, yes, it is. A lot of it has to do with the geometry of the emitters to the detectors and how those are laid out and how you prevent the crosstalk between the emitters and the detectors. But in general, multiple photodiodes are helpful for increasing accuracy. The challenge is the increased power consumption, and then also increased cost for adding additional hardware to devices. But again, it depends on the use case and the form factor you're looking at. The next question is the ear means earlobe or inside of the ear, or any particular location in the ear. Great question. I should have clarified that earlier. Thank you for bringing it up. We find that the best location on the ear is at the bottom of the concha. So in the concha bowl, not on the earlobe, but actually inside the ear bowl, just below the antitragus, in the bottom of the concha in the ear is the best location that we have found. With that said, it also works behind the tragus and in the ear canal as well. You're dealing with different motion artifacts in those areas, so you have to compensate for those different motion artifacts than what you see at the bottom of the concha, even though you're talking about millimeters or a very small difference in location in terms of distance. It's you are dealing with different motion artifacts, different motion characteristics there that you have to account for. Really good questions. Thanks for all of these. Keep them coming. So let's get back to where, okay, so this I think this is where we left off. Let's dive into a few examples of how companies are using biometric parameters in wearable devices of all kinds. And I'll preface this by saying we can't talk about exactly how most of our customers are using biometric parameters because they don't want us talking about that publicly. I can say at a high level, most of them are using the signal quality, the being worn indicator that I mentioned before, as well as the activity characterization. But there are a few interesting examples that we can talk about publicly, and I'll go through a few of those now. Let's see, come over here. So this is a company called Sana Health. And actually, if you are on our email list, they were featured in a webinar we did last month. And Richard at Sana Health, who you see pictured here with the device on the screen behind his head, has built a pain management device using a biometric as well as light signals and light therapy to help address severe chronic pain management. And he is the inspiration and the reason for developing this device. He was in a really bad car accident and has been dealing with chronic pain issues and severe chronic pain issues since that car accident. And this device is helping him address those issues. And as it relates to biometric parameters, I've linked to the recording of the webinar here. If you want to get more details on them, I encourage you to either go to their website or check out that webinar at that link. There's two interesting elements of how they're using biometric parameters here. One is they did a lot of their initial research with EEG, and this comes back to the question before of can a PPG sensor measure brain activity? Well, the EEG certainly can measure brain activity, and they were using the EEG on the forehead as in some of their initial prototypes, and it worked. EEG is just not very scalable in a mass consumer device for a variety of different reasons that Richard actually touches on in that webinar, and he has a lot more expertise there than I do. But there's challenges there in scaling that technology to a large number of users and devices. And they found that measuring heart rate variability, particularly the high frequency HRV at the forehead with the valence cell sensor, is enabled them to replace all of the EEG sensors in that device and just use the PPG sensor and HRV as a signal to understand how the individual is reacting to the light therapy that's coming in through the device, and adjust that and modulate that light therapy accordingly based on the real-time biofeedback that's coming from the individual. And then, of course, they also use the signal quality indicator to understand when and when not to use the data, but also to help them understand how long they need to take a measurement to make sure that the effect they are seeing from the light therapy is actually an accurate measurement of that response to the light therapy. So in some cases, they need to measure HRV for about a minute. In some cases, if the person is not wearing the device correctly, or the signal quality is indicating that they need more time, they'll extend that measurement time past a minute until they get enough high quality data for them to make an accurate assessment off of. So that is the Sana Health story, or at least a quick summary of the Sana Health story. I encourage you to check out more about what they're doing. It's really fascinating and really valuable work they're doing, especially with the opioid crisis and the effects of that, particularly here in the U.S. Being able to address severe pain and severe chronic pain without pharmaceuticals, without opioids, is a really important endeavor. It looks like we had one other question come in as I was talking about that. Will the valence cell sensor provide raw data too? Part of that depends on what you mean by raw data, but in general, I'll say as a standard output from our sensor modules, we provide the post-processed data with all of the motion tolerance and all of the motion artifacts removed to give you a clean PPG signal that outputs heart rate variabilities, the other biometrics that I mentioned before, as well as the biometric parameters. So next example here is a very extreme example and also a great example of an organization using biometric parameters for research purposes. So this happens to be the US Air Force, and they have a centrifuge down in San Antonio, Texas, where they subject Air Force pilots to high G environments. And one of the challenges they have is being, or one of the things they're looking at is how can they identify in advance before a pilot actually passes out because of the high G force associated with some of these fighter planes. Can they see that with enough warning to be able to alert the pilot and take some evasive action to be able to prevent them from passing out and obviously the potentially deadly ramifications of passing out at the controls of a fighter jet. So what they were able to identify using the normalized pulse amplitude, in addition to the heart rate here, is that a jump in the heart rate combined with a drop in the pulsatile blood volume or the pulsatile amplitude indicates that the subject either has lost consciousness or is about to lose consciousness. So you can see some of those implications here, and I'll do this overlay here where they have identified the heart rate threshold and the amplitude threshold, below which or above which they have identified, and in these cases, in these green bars here, is when these particular subjects, in this case Air Force pilots, lost consciousness for at least several seconds, and so that has enabled them to, start to build in some warning systems to. Sorry, minor technical difficulties here. My PowerPoint went away. Just to finish out that story, the Air Force has enabled them to build in some warning systems to be able to identify when the pilot is about to lose consciousness and hopefully avoid those scenarios. It's like my PowerPoint just died on me. Great timing. So apologies for that. I will get that back up and running here momentarily. The next example I was about to go into is using that pulsatile amplitude, and this is an example of something that we're working on here at Valencell and rolling out later this year, is the ability to measure blood pressure off of these sensor modules that that we put into wearable devices of all kinds. My apologies here, my PowerPoint does not seem to want to come back up, of course. So sorry about that. Looks like we did have another question come in while we're waiting. Are there any plans for Valencell to combine EEG with PPG in the ear? At this point, we do not have plans for that. Let me get some of this out of the way. We don't have plans for that, but that being said, some of our customers may be combining those two. But that's Valencell is explicitly focused on PPG sensor technology. We do have, oh, hey, look at that. Our my PowerPoint is finally coming back up. So my apologies for that. Back to the question, we don't have any plans to combine EEG with our PPG sensor modules right now, but that doesn't mean our customers couldn't do that in a device designed around the sensor fusion of EEG and PPG for different use cases. So finally back up and running here, I think. So there's Santa Health and our Air Force example we talked about before. And here's the what we have identified with using the normalized PPG amplitude, and identified that it indeed tracks with systolic blood pressure. Now we're getting at the diastolic blood pressure in other ways, but this is another good example of how to use this biometric parameter data as contextualized information around how that individual's blood flow characteristics are performing, and how that changes over time, and how it changes in different activity contexts. So I think I've already talked through that, and it looks like with that, that's it. So that's it in terms of the prepared materials I have. Sorry for the minor technical difficulties there, thanks to PowerPoint, but I'll see if there are any other questions that have come in. It looks like there are a couple more. So if you do have other questions, please do submit those through the GoToWebinar interface. Are there any ready-made wearables that Valencell provides? No, we don't provide any of the wearables themselves. We provide the sensor technology to our customers who are building devices that need accurate biometrics, and we help them integrate that technology into whatever device they're building. So we don't make any of the wearables themselves, just the sensor technology that goes in them. Let's see. Can we connect the Valencell? This is the next question. Can we connect the Valencell sensor to our own data acquisition hardware? Not entirely sure what you mean by data acquisition hardware, but I'll give you a sense of how our sensors typically integrate into our customers' wearable devices. And that is over a serial port using I2C or UART as a comms protocol. And we've got a standard API that the host processor of the device calls that API for heart rate or R interval or any of the biometric parameters that I just described, calls for that information. We provide that information off of our sensor systems, and then that host processor does whatever it is intended to do with that data, either send that to an analytics platform somewhere, or present that data on a watch interface, or feed that data, over BLE, over the BLE heart rate profile into a mobile app, or wherever it's intended to go. So if that didn't answer your question, please submit a follow-up question, and I'll try to address that. But hopefully that answered your question. I don't see any other questions coming in at the moment. So I'll take this time to just say thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules here today. I hope you found this to be valuable. And if you have any other follow-up questions, or if you think of any after we close the webinar here, feel free to reach out to me directly. That's my email, or reach out to me on Twitter. And I'm happy to discuss any of these topics we covered here, or anything else you think we might be able to help with. So Oh, good. I thought another question came through, but that was just telling me that I did answer the previous question. So good. So glad that was answered, and I don't see any other questions come in. We'll go ahead and wrap up here, but thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.